All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this I guess we have decent DC weather today, so thank you, everybody. This is the panel on the Canadian hard power in the world, so thank you again for joining us. So I guess we'll jump right in. Canada's lead is entering into its largest defense investment since the Korean War and early Cold War buildup, when it undertook major rearmament to fight Korea and prepare for the great power competition. But unlike the Cold War era, Canada now faces simultaneous pressure from across military readiness, industrial capacity, economic security, crime, foreign interference, and hybrid threats to operate below the threshold of traditional conflict. Today's discussion is about whether Canada can restore credible hard power in an era where military capability, economic resilience, strategic industries, and societal stability are increasingly interconnected. Today's speakers are Scott McGregor, who is a senior fellow and senior advisor on the Council on Countering Hybrid Warfare. He focuses on China, hybrid warfare, economic coercion, organized crime, and North American resilience. Retired General Christopher Coates is our other panelist. He is Director of Foreign Policy at the National Defense and National Security, former senior Royal Canadian Air Force commander and with NORAD and continental defense experience. And we also have Dr. Rebecca Jensen, who is a RUSI Associate Fellow in Military Studies, a security think tank focused on military strategy and national security, and Dr. David Perry, who is President and CEO of Canadian Global Affairs Institute and host of the Defense Deconstructed podcast. And my name is Bella Grabowski. Those of you who I haven't met yet, I'm campaign director at AFPI, so I cover all things national security, foreign policy, and immigration. So thank you again for joining us. So I guess we'll start off with you, Dr. Jensen. So historically, Canada surged hard power during moments like the Korean War and early Cold War. What triggered those shifts historically, and what are we seeing as a similar inflection point now?
So I think we saw a convergence of a few things in the 90s. There was the holiday from history that most of the West subscribed to, right? This idea that major war was over and therefore we didn't need to prepare for it. In Canada in particular, in the wake of a debacle in Somalia, there was a sharp drop in support for the military. And to the extent that it was understood that Canada had to have a military, there developed this understanding that peacekeeping, which Canadians take credit for inventing, which is perhaps not completely accurate, was what a military is for. So in Afghanistan, General Hillier was asked if this was a peacekeeping mission, and he said, no, our job is to break things and kill people, and this was extraordinarily controversial. So I'd argue that a lot of this, politicians are rational actors. They do what they're rewarded for doing, and they were elected by an electorate that overwhelmingly, genuinely believed that the purpose of a military was to carry out peacekeeping and stabilization tasks, which I wouldn't argue is not a legitimate function of the military, but it's not the existential reason for one, and if you're very good at the existential part, you can probably adapt to the other roles fairly well. The problem we're seeing right now, in my view, is that while a lot of NATO has gotten more serious about what militaries need to be able to do, and while, to give them credit, the Canadian military has gotten vastly more serious, there's only so much the military can do in the absence of meaningful support from cabinet or the electorate, or ideally both.
Could you go into a little bit more about like the military and civil relationship in the context of Canada and how that has changed historically, what we're looking at right now? Because from what we're seeing, at least like on the United States side, it seems like the defense and political side are in completely different boats, in a sense.
One feature, I've been lucky enough to live in the US for most of the last decade and to work with the Army and the Marine Corps. There's a lot of discussion here about how there's an increasing civ-mil divide, that how I believe in the US, the biggest predictor of whether someone will join the military is if they have a relative or a close family friend in the military. In Canada, the situation is much more pronounced. Our military installations are typically not where people live, which is fair enough. If you're going to be testing tanks, you can't do that in a suburb of Toronto. But it leads to the fact where you can be an educated cosmopolitan Canadian and spend most of your life never really knowing anyone in the military or understanding what it's for. This translates into our government. So unlike in the US, the defense minister has to be drawn from the members of parliament, of the winning party or the coalition parties in power. The odds of someone in this fairly narrow group having knowledge of or experience with the military is vanishingly small. In the decades after the Second World War, essentially all men, had some time in the military. Everyone knew people in the military. And then that's slowly been reduced to the point where it's actually quite rare to have sitting parliamentarians who have been in the military or worked with it or studied it extensively. So that has implications as well.
And so I guess, General Coates, from an operational standpoint, what concerns you the most right now with Canada and the state of affairs?
Yeah, wow. It would be a long list if I was to give you a shopping list, but I'll just categorize it sort of along two lines. First is the whole idea of the rebuilding the military and the large investments that are going to be required to do that. So while for about 10, 15 years, Canada did not invest at the levels needed in its military, at that same time, the requirements were going up. So the capabilities of the Canadian Armed Forces were stagnant while the requirements were increasing, and we weren't closing that gap. The gap was getting wider. But on top of that, today, if we were to bring a military, to create a military today, the requirements are even higher on where we want to be and what we would need a military to be able to do. So the first step is to build back that debt, that capability debt that we've incurred in our infrastructure, in the equipment, in the capital capabilities of the military, but then create a military that's modern and that can do the things that it has to be able to do. So I'm concerned operationally about that. Secondly, and it's like was just mentioned, for quite a period of time, Canada's military was focused on what we call contribution warfare. So we just contributed troops to somebody else's fight, as it were. And the measure of success when you're doing that is quite discretionary. Whereas today we're now entering a world where the threats are existential, and Canada has to become involved in deterrence warfare. And so the difference between contribution warfare and deterrence is a pretty high bar. And we don't have the history, we don't have the living memory of how to assemble the military or to have the civil military relations that are necessary to support a military that's embarking in deterrence operations. So the two things: rebuild a military and then create a military that's focused on deterrence, not just contribution warfare.
I agree with that entirely. If I can add to what General Coates said, there is a mentality in Canada that argues we had no appreciable military in 1913 or 1938. We still punched well above our weight in the world wars, which is true, but that is not how the world works anymore. The government has recently been spending money hand over fist in an attempt to meet NATO targets, which benefits me personally because defense academics get emails saying, do you have any urgent research needs we could fund, which I appreciate, even though it's not actually about my research. But you can't solve this problem with money alone. The Commonwealth Air Training Plan in the Second World War trained between a third and a half of all pilots in the Commonwealth. This was a time when you could take a farm kid without a driver's license and drop him in this school and a few months later have a competent pilot. You could turn over a car factory and a few weeks later be producing aircraft. None of this is true anymore. You can't produce pilots in months, no matter how much you trim, how intensely they train. You can't produce these aircraft on that kind of timeline. So one of the things that we have to grapple with is, it's very good that we're committing to modernizing, to acquiring 21st century platforms. What are we going to do in the meantime?
No, that was kind of my next question. I was gonna actually ask about the defense spending and building back, because that's been a topic of conversation here in the United States. I mean, we have a pretty big ask as well from Congress. You know, we want $1.3 trillion going into our defense budget. So Canada's kind of in a similar boat in that sense. So Dr. Perry, if you want to go into a little bit more of like, you know, what your thoughts are on the industry side and what you're seeing from there and how they could contribute, and even the United States too, and I'll open it up to anyone on the panel here as well.
Sure. So I think there's been huge change, but we're still a fair bit shy of $1 trillion, and likely not going to get close to that. Because I think to build off some of the things the ambassador said in terms of a wider hard power context, while our economy is a lot smaller than yours, it is still the 10th or 11th, depending on how you figure out the calculation. So the contribution that we're aiming at now for a share of our GDP, given the size of our overall economy, is really fairly meaningful. In straight dollar terms, we're back to being the 6th largest spender in the NATO alliance. Now we're kind of playing tag with Poland for the 6th position there. But because of our significant economic potential, the amounts are larger. And in the wider context, the government, I mean, it's really remarkable living in Ottawa, like how much has changed with the change in government and Prime Minister Carney coming into office. And I think the biggest thing I'd say that's different for other audiences to note is that the mindset politically is radically different than it's been, I think, basically since we had troops fighting in Afghanistan. So you've now actually got defense and security actually figured into the top priority list of the government and on their political agenda for the first time since we had troops in Kandahar. It's something that the government's actually tracking in all of its budget communications. The Prime Minister's engaged personally out there making announcements himself. We really haven't seen that in a long time, and there's a whole bunch of flow-through of that throughout our wider system because it's now something that wasn't just folks like General Coates arguing about all those real material needs, but it's something that the politicians have embraced, and that's changed a whole bunch of things, including getting us to the point where we met the NATO target last fiscal year. And just to put that in context, we're on a trajectory where there's going to be big growth that's being discussed and funding committed to. But in the last 5 years, our top line spend on defense is increased by 100%, and the amount going into investment, specifically into capital equipment infrastructure in the last 4 years, has increased by 4.5 times. So the modernization is really actually already kicked into gear now, largely with a continental focus. But the shift has really been remarkable just in the last 15 months.
Yeah, have there been any particular industries that have popped off, like since that spending has been announced or anything like that? Any partnerships or any countries? I mean, I was going to ask about China, of course, so I'd love to hear a little bit on that and what Canada is doing with Chinese investment as well in that context.
If you're looking at where we are right now, like the biggest bulk of investment's gone into American defense primes. So our Air Force is going through the most extensive recapitalization that it's undertaken at the same time since the early 1950s. Money's going to General Atomics, Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon. That's really where the bulk of the investment that's actually hit the books right now has been going. The government's, I think, trying to build up more of a national industrial base moving forward. But if you're talking about like where we're actually spending our money last fiscal year and today, it's largely with American firms.
And I guess, Scott, this kind of leads into my question because that's why I brought up China as well. So now in your world, you look at China a little bit differently. So, and in the Canada context, can you talk about a little bit like what your biggest worries are in that context as well?
Yeah. Thank you, Bella. Yes, I come from a little bit of a different world. I'm not a procurement guy, logistics or anything like that. I look at national security threats and how they operate within Canada and abroad. I think the biggest problem that I see over the last 10 years has been the convergence between threats. So I deal with hybrid threats, which kind of stays below the threshold of kinetic events, although sometimes it does include those things. In regards to China, the infiltration that we've seen in Canada and the United States has been so immense that it impacts every aspect of law enforcement, intelligence, and security. We're talking a little bit about some of the moves that Canada's making in increasing our defense ability, but Canada doesn't really have the same scale or scope of a defense industry. You've mentioned some American companies that we're currently engaged with, which is beneficial to us, and that kind of highlights the relationship that we have. I would dare say that China right now, in terms of infiltration within Canada, is so extensive that it's within every single national security level law enforcement file. That's very, very significant. And that is something that the United States has identified in Canada. I'm holding a book right here, and the basis of that book is built off of a formerly classified document called Dragon Lord. That document identifies Canada as a national security threat to the United States 30 years ago. So for 30 years, we've had this infiltration and this advancement of China getting into our economics, our politics, our corporations, and inside some institutions. And so those threats that are internal are something that Canada needs to address, and it directly impacts how we move forward in the hard power situation.
So how would you say, from like a military perspective, I'm looking at Dr. Jensen and General Coates, given all that with China, how do you think that impacts military readiness? And like, do you think that that's something that the military is considering right now? Because frankly, I mean, in the Pentagon, we're kind of seeing a very different shift in the approach to hybrid warfare, just given, you know, the connection of fentanyl and things coming across the border, both southern and northern. So I was wondering if Canada is looking at that as well.
So I would say this ties into what I see as another challenge. As Dr. Perry says, there's increasing awareness and possibly room for optimism about what you could call the hardware side of it. I would say, and I do have a bias, the software is at least as important, right? You buy your iPhone, but what keeps it working 4 years later is the software updates. There's room for optimism here in some ways, certainly. The services have all done very good jobs, in my view, of changing force structure, developing new operating concepts, refining their tactics and their doctrine. The CAF jointly, less so, but that arguably is not as much of a problem because we're not realistically going to operate as a joint force in the near future. Our joint PME, on the other hand, hasn't caught up. I've had students tell me that their main takeaway is what they refer to as the Globe and Mail test, which I guess here you would call the New York Times test. Are you going to do anything that's going to get you on the front page of the national newspaper? This is not an irrelevant concern. This should not be the main takeaway for students from intermediate level schooling or top level schooling. And hybrid ties into this. If you are not thinking rigorously about the ways in which conflict occurs, you're by definition not going to be prepared for it. And this is a challenge in part because it involves talking about things that are frequently seen as impolite to discuss, candidly. And in part, I think, because we, like a lot of Western countries, are still trapped in the dichotomies that exist for good reason that used to serve us fairly well. The distinction between domestic and international, the distinction between what you are allowed to do with regard to citizens versus non-citizens. And the problem is this is broken down. One of the elements of hybrid warfare is that it collapses these distinctions. And there aren't easy answers here. I'm not arguing that we should stop extending special protections to citizens. Obviously we should. The question is, how do you do this in a way that lets you defend against hybrid threats?
If I could, I agree entirely, and just like to add to that, where the Canadian Armed Forces are leading international operations, so in Latvia, leading the Enhanced Force Protection Brigade on behalf of NATO there, the Canadian military has recognized and does take action to mitigate the effects of hybrid threats. But in Canada itself, that's not a military lead to deal with hybrid threats, which are by their very nature very comprehensive and span information, economics, legal and lawfare kinds of considerations. And Canada does not have a national security culture, period. And so there's no threat perception amongst Canadians that there could be a threat lurking behind that door or under that cover or somewhere in society around them. And so while the politicians are sensitive to external pressures to modernize our military right now, there are no pressures external to deal with the hybrid threats, and there are no internal pressures because Canadians are naive for the most part and not willing to accept that there are threats within that have to be addressed.
So I guess, I know you mentioned that Canada, in the military side, doesn't really have a way to address, like, formally hybrid threats, correct? Like, in the way that you were saying that? Because I just wanted to hear, because I just would love to hear, like, how Canada is looking at this issue set, if they are, or if they're looking at anything to do with authorities or things like that around the military, but like conversations between law enforcement, things like that. I ask because, again, like the Pentagon is working really closely with some of our counterparts on the law enforcement side to ensure that, you know, things are enforced. So I'd love to hear, you know, a little bit more on that, of course. So
the Canadian military, like in the U.S., is limited in what it can do domestically. So I'll turn it over to Scott for what's actually going on in Canada to address hybrid threats.
Thank you. So I'm not sure if anyone's read my bio, but I would recommend digging in a little bit just to understand where my perspective comes from, the lens that I view these things, and some of my experiences. So I'm a military veteran. I was one of the first guys into Kandahar. So I've experienced combat and some of the influences there. In terms of hybrid warfare, it's something that I learned when I left the military and moved into law enforcement. So I've worked with some of the big guys. One of them's in the crowd right now, who's worked transnational organized crime. So when we look at hybrid warfare, it basically entails three things. Sharp power, which is the political influence piece, soft power, which is the economic subversion piece, and then transnational organized crime. And all those things are intertwined. Very difficult for the military to understand that and gain access to it. In the United States in 2011, President Obama had an executive order that identified transnational organized crime as a national security threat. What that did was it allowed information sharing between agencies, between law enforcement and military. So now we had collection assets that could look at these things and discuss it with military or with law enforcement. In Canada, we don't have that. That capability does not exist, but it does. It's there, and I know this because I'm one of the people that introduced it to the military. It's difficult to make it happen because it's relationship-based, unfortunately. It's not mainstream. It's not something that's become a policy at this point. We were very close to it, but unfortunately, I moved on and others moved on, and the world continues to grow. There is an ability to look at these things. I was the senior domestic intelligence analyst for the West Coast of North America. I specifically looked at those things, but the focus was more on counterterrorism at the time. Moving into some of the law enforcement threats as people would view them now, we look at them in a linear fashion. We see them as incidents. We don't see them as a cohesive threat. And unfortunately, that's the problem. We're starting to move that way. I think a panel like this is starting to look at exactly how comprehensive these things are. China is involved in all of these aspects. They use their proxies. They infiltrate institutions. And so it's undermining those things. And right now, we need to come together with our allies to start to do something about that, whether that's root them out, amend policies, legislation, especially in Canada, so that we can have some enforcement. Detect, deter, disrupt, interdict is a model that I would use.
Can I?
I was just going to say, I would add one thing to my colleagues. I mean, I think we probably haven't been doing as much of this as we should, and I think part of that's just been a question of priority setting and focus. I mean, the degree to other activity that's happening right now is so expansive just in conventional power investment. The Air Force is doing fleet expansion, modernization, as well as replacement. The Army is doing a reorganization to be able to operate at a division structure. The Navy's doing significant fleet expansion. We're putting a whole bunch more money into cyber space capability, and I think there's really a fundamental bandwidth limitation about how much attention and resources there are to be that comprehensive, and I think we're spending the effort to really focus on core conventional capability first.
And if I can add on the question of transnational crime, the theater I study the most is the Euro-Atlantic. I've deployed in support of the mission in Latvia. There in particular, I would say, perhaps optimistically, the odds of Canadian troops in Latvia being harmed tomorrow by Russia's military are extraordinarily low. The odds of them being harmed by Russian organized crime, this has occurred. This is an ongoing daily threat. And the issue is Russian organized crime is functionally part of the Russian government. This is not like the relationship between the Hells Angels and the government of Canada, which are adversarial and trying to shut each other down. This is, not quite an irregular branch of the Russian military, but also not that. And our failure to understand that is fundamental to our inability to deal with it properly, amongst the other problems that the panelists have discussed.
I'm just going to add on to that a little bit. When you mentioned the Russian mafia threat, understanding that these countries, as nation states, operate together with intent, that's something that's lost, I think, on a lot of people. The other thing is that, namely China, they're influencing mainstream media and suppressing a lot of information, so it's very difficult for the population to gain an understanding of what's going on if they're not getting it. So they're getting it from alternative news sources, which don't always hold the credibility that the average citizen expects. I think within intelligence circles, we've known this the whole time. A lot of this, not necessarily all the hybrid pieces, but we understand who the threats are. we share that with our allies. Right now, there are Canadian vessels and aircraft and troops that are out there looking at the same threats to North America as the United States and other allies. That hasn't changed. All the rhetoric that you hear in the news about discourse within politics, that's not the same as what's happening when it comes to protecting the people of this continent. And I think that's something that's lost a little bit, not necessarily on all the people attending this conference, but on the general population, I do believe that that's true. Moving forward, I would say that information warfare is going to be one of the key elements in identifying how people react and increase their comprehension and understanding of what those threats are.
And I guess going off of that, I wanted to open it up to anyone on the panel here. How do you think Canada should think about protecting its critical industries, supply chains, to basically reach that balance? Because, you know, we do have modernization that's needed in both camps, both in the United States and in Canada. And there are certain things in our supply chains both that there is a reliance on China, unfortunately, and cutting that off is not possible right away. So I would just love to hear about what Canada is doing to reach that balance. So to anyone that's willing to answer.
Maybe I'd start. I guess there's an interesting dynamic where I think we recognize the need to do that. We're pretty on board with that agenda, and there's been a little bit of uncertainty in the last year and a bit about exactly how that meshes in a wider North American construct. I forget the exact analogy. It was high walls, low fences, whatever that dynamic is about trying to build a North American secure supply chain construct, and that includes a bunch of core defense inputs, things like steel into a wider market because we hadn't specialized on defense application, aluminum that went into core aerospace manufacturing, critical minerals agenda, and I think there'd been a recognition of the need to do that and take a number of different measures, including with some of the trade regime that we had with China. And then in the last 15 months, I think there's been a questioning about whether or not we're on the same page anymore and how what we were on a trajectory to do nets into the idea of having a secure North American supply base that's de-risked, that's tried to remove vulnerabilities from external inputs and try and create as much solidity around what you're producing in North America as possible.
Sorry, I'm going to piggyback a little bit. I think there's two things. I'm going to give myself a plug for the Council on Countering Hybrid Warfare, which is a burgeoning think tank looking at negotiations, conflict management, arbitration, because right now we are in a big conflict. The hybrid conflict has been going on for a long time, and it's definitely one of the major factors in what's impacting us, both with information that's coming into politics, but also the information that's going out. We work with education, and we think that that's the way, as mentioned on the panel previously, that people are going to become more informed, mainly within the legal system, because that's where all these conflicts seem to be going. The other side of that is the corporate factor. Corporations are the ones that are dealing with these countries, and they're looking at difficulties within jurisdictions and restrictions and constraints that we have within the countries that they operate. Those are being exploited, and we need to engage with the corporate sector, the private sector, to help them understand what the benefits are of moving towards something that's a little more friendly, I guess is the term that I would use.
I'd also add, along with things like education and resilience to information warfare, like making the supply chain more robust, there's also something in terms of resilience and hardening society that is simple, if not easy. If you wanted to prevent the Canadian military from engaging, and you wanted to do it cheaply and possibly deniably, then I wouldn't stop 2 Brigade from deploying to Europe with a kinetic attack. I would do it by taking out the traffic lights in Petawawa and the rails that would take the troops and their kit to the port in Montreal. Part of the challenge is that the military is aware of this vulnerability. Addressing it is not by any means a military task or something for which they have the capability. Canada is a less cash-centric society than the US. People don't typically pay cash. A few years ago, the Interact network, the primary one through which people pay from their debit accounts, went down for a couple of days in Ontario, and it caused havoc because people aren't accustomed to having a week of edibles and some cash on hand. And this was, to the best of my knowledge, I am less informed than perhaps some of the people on this panel, a genuine mistake, not an attack. And yet it caused a lot of damage to the economy and how people operated for a few days. If someone were to do something of greater duration and greater scope on purpose, it could be devastating. This is something we should be hardening against as well.
So I guess with all that being said, the U.S. and Canada defense relationship is foundational to both Canadian and U.S. military planning. And I'll open it up again to the panel here. How does that relationship shape Canada's operational posture and structure right now, given what we talked about? And how is that approach, given kind of the political rhetoric coming, from both countries right now, how Canada is doing that on the defense side?
I'll start. The Canadian-U.S. military relationship has been foundational for generations. So coming out of the Ogdensburg Agreement in the Second World War, Canada and the U.S. decided that the best way to defend the continent was to do it together. And so that drove a particular alignment between the two militaries to work to do that, NORAD and all things associated with it. But then, at the same time, Canada recognized that as a minor military power, its military contributions were best applied in concert with allies, and the U.S. was the natural partner. So for generations, the Canadian military has been absolutely 100% interoperable with the U.S. military. I say 100%, right? So, close to. And that has driven the development of Canada's military capabilities. And that hasn't changed today. And so we've already heard on the panel that the way that the Canadian military is operating alongside the U.S. military today has continued, regardless of the political frictions. I've been at NORAD in leadership positions through various cross-border tensions, and you don't notice it. You just carry on doing the job, and those cycles work themselves out. This is a bit more than one of those cycles. And I think it's important that we get realigned strategically so that we can take advantage of this strong partnership. Eventually, those frictions would permeate the military layer, but at the moment they haven't. And we remain, a very strong and capable partner to the U.S. Within the capabilities that the government provides.
I would say the military-to-military relationship between the two countries has been exceptionally strong on the operational level, I would say going back at least to the first Special Service Force. And nothing I have seen suggests that that is different today, despite whatever tensions exist at the head of government level or in terms of deteriorating public opinion. I know this is the case for the Army. I believe it is the case for the Air Force and the Navy in Canada, that while the NATO role is an increasingly important part of Canada's identity and policy priorities, this in no way diminishes the commitment to ongoing interoperability and training with the U.S. We have deputy commanding generals from the Canadian Army embedded in American corps. My two-star boss has a deputy who's a U.S. Army officer. This is a level of integration that is very rare between two sovereign countries, and it does not appear to be under threat despite whatever else is happening.
So I build off all that. I agree with all of that trajectory. I mean, we've basically been on an 80-year pathway of having increasingly close collaboration with American allies. I think the but to the sentence, though, is that I do think that it's really difficult to understate how publicly and politically salient the tariff actions on auto, steel, aluminum, softwood have been in Canada and how much they're driving the political narrative. And I think the unfortunate reality of that is that while almost all the folks in the defense, military, national security bureaucracy want things to keep working basically as they have been on a path for generations, it's created, those tariff actions have created a dynamic where I think it's making things that would have been stone cold no-brainers a year and a half ago verging on politically impossible, just because of some of the optics. And I think that's creating a really significant tension between defense and security apparatus that wants to keep working the same way, but it's a really difficult political challenge for the government right now based on how some of those actions have been received and how publicly visible they are across the country.
So I guess going off of that, can one of you go over just the NORAD relationship? I know we touched on it a couple times, but if we could go over that and also just what NORAD modernization is looking like right now, just given what we talked about on the panel.
I guess I could do that. And so historically, Canada and the U.S., as the ambassador mentioned, in a bi-national relationship through NORAD, one single organization with Canadians and Americans side by side under one set of orders, one set of equipment that's provided by both countries, defending against air threats. And it's evolved over time. There have been evolutions of NORAD's capabilities as the threats have changed. NORAD has to deal with that evolution of threats today. And so the NORAD of today is insufficient to deal with the threats that Russia and China present in terms of long-range precision, low radar cross-section cruise missiles, for example, and the follow-on threats. And so the modernization that Canada is undertaking is to help bring NORAD up to speed to be able to deal with those threats at range, at distance, and restore deterrence. The U.S. doesn't have a NORAD modernization program. It doesn't need one. It is modernizing its force just as a measure of its business model. But Canada has had to encapsulate that under a separate program-style approach.
So I guess, can Canada realistically rebuild the hard power that it needs for deeper integration with the United States? And if so, I guess, like, how long do you think that would take and what that would look like?
My answer would be that we could, but I don't think that's in anyone's interest. And I think to go back to some of those political dynamics, I mean, I think there is an undercurrent of wanting to have diversification of relationships just because of all the uncertainty that's been introduced. I think it would be nonsensical, suboptimal, whatever kind of qualifier you want to put on it. It would be a very bad outcome for the entire continent. But I wouldn't discount that, like, that is possible, but just extremely undesirable.
Yeah, I'm with Dave. It might be possible, but it would test the bounds of feasibility in some cases, only in terms of production capability. Our allies so if it's not the U.S., then that capability has to come from somewhere else, maybe Europe, and there's a limited amount of production capability in Europe as well. So I'd question whether there's even production capacity out there that could deliver it in the time frame needed.
My only caveat would be that as much as there is political pressure and a legitimately strong case for diversifying our relationships, the security of Canada is a legitimate interest of the U.S., and the U.S. has the capability and the proximity to help defend it if needed. We have crossed the Atlantic repeatedly to help Europe. I'm not convinced how many members of NATO would be prepared to cross the Atlantic in the other direction if necessary, and for that matter, the great majority of them do not have the ability to force project. So if we're talking about a partner who could defend essential Canadian interests and Canadian sovereignty, there is only one candidate at this point.
I'm just going to add a little bit, mainly from personal experience. Canada doesn't have a defense industry that can produce the tools that we would need to address kinetic events that could happen. And I do say could happen. We know that there's a hybrid war going on. We know we're being attacked right now. And those things need to be addressed first. During my time in fusion centers, in combat zones, the United States has saved more Canadian lives than I can number. We didn't have helicopters that could airlift people out of the field when you're 10,000 feet above sea level. The Americans came in and helped us out. Right now, the relationship between the United States and Canada seems strained, but I know for a fact that we care about each other, and we're not going to leave each other behind. Right now, we may not have that capability, but through negotiation and hopefully some future collaboration, that's why I mentioned the corporate sector and how important it is in defending this hemisphere. I think that's the way ahead. I think that we have to engage at a corporate level so that we can start to move things forward, and hopefully Canada catches up in way, shape, or form. Right now, the United States has identified the threats a little bit earlier than Canada, and Canada's lagging a little bit behind, but it doesn't mean that, that it's not going to get there. I just think that, we have some catching up to do, as you mentioned, and I think that the way to do that is through corporate negotiation and hopefully collaboration.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about sovereignty. That word's been thrown around a lot lately, not just in the United States, but we're seeing it more and more even in Europe. So with that being said, a lot of the times people often try to avoid connecting the two between military capability and national sovereignty, but in my mind, I put them hand in hand. So I was just wondering what Canada's approach is in the sovereignty conversation in the context of this, and also how that plays a role in how Canada approaches its allies as well.
I could start. I think a little bit like the ambassador outlined, we've seen a surge in Canadian patriotism in really interesting ways, including in places that have their own sub-regional nationalist movements. The province of Quebec's had a big surge in attachment to the rest of the country in a really interesting way. I think that term sovereignty in particular is getting thrown around in a whole bunch of different ways. I think in a way it's become a bit of like a nationalistic Rorschach test. It's kind of the eye of the beholder. What label kind of gets a maple syrup stamp of approval on it? It's not a lot of specificity, and I think it's incredibly difficult in a bunch of these circumstances to actually try to assign passport to people, to capability, to supply chain, because we've developed a North American economic security and defense unit that has worked collaboratively for so long that in a whole bunch of different areas, it's really difficult to assign a label of something being exclusively American or Canadian, because we've built it together. And so that's created a lot of tension. Big American companies they largely have Canadian lines of operation, vice versa in some cases. So trying to figure out what passport you would assign to particular capabilities, competencies, has become a thornier question because we've designed it together.
I think there's a concern as Canada is moving forward with its defense modernization to come out the other end with more sovereign control over certain things. Maybe not the defense base itself, but the way the information that is being used and processed is controlled. So Canada will be looking for opportunities to create Canadian capability in information control and the intellectual property that's associated with some of the capabilities that they're developing, more so than in the past. And so I think that's to the benefit of our partners as well, because then Canada becomes more invested and stronger itself. So I think it's a net good, but that will be a change in terms of sovereignty, is how does Canada control the information that's associated with modern weapon systems.
I'm going to move in a little bit of a different direction and mention something that we've discussed recently, which is about humility and ego. And Canadians have a proud heritage, and we're very patriotic, but there's a difference between diversity and unity. And I like to use the analogy of a sports team where you take all these professional players that come from all these different backgrounds and unique qualities, and you can put them all together on a hockey rink or on a soccer pitch, and they play like individuals. It's only when they come together and they have this unity that they actually end up moving forward. Canada's kind of in that boat right now, and when we look at our sovereignty, we're pretty fractured in a lot of ways, and we see some division, along ethical lines and some other things. So until we start to come together, it's very hard to move things in the direction you want, whether governments, leading the way or corporations are. I think once we start to get there, and I think these discussions are happening now, I think that's when we'll be, a little more comfortable with our sovereignty. We can check our ego, realize where we work, where we sit in the world, and start to address the real issues head on with allies and not alone.
I would say military capability is fundamental to sovereignty. Canadians and Americans and a lot of other countries might disagree about the role of the state in providing health care or regulating trade. Nobody disagrees that the defense of the country is arguably the core responsibility of a Westphalian state. Canada historically functioned in many ways as a protectorate, right? Initially of the UK, after the Second World War of the US. And that served us very well because these were very friendly relationships. We had a bubble of protection that we enjoyed that we largely did not have to pay for. This was never going to last forever, and it is starting to come to an end. So the question to me now is, are we going to choose to rise to the challenge? There is, in a lot of ways, yes, I agree with Dr. Perry, a surge of patriotism. So far, it is mostly, in my observation, manifesting in people buying Tim Hortons coffee beans at the grocery store and not Starbucks. What we need to see is there going to be a willingness to cut the social safety net so we can invest in security, not just the military, but in all the other aspects of it? Are people going to start encouraging their children to join the CAF? You can have as many slogans as you want. You can boycott American produce as much as you want. Unless you're actually willing to do things that are difficult, we're not going to rise to the challenge.
Thank you. And so before we open it up to questions, I was going to ask, one-liner, one main takeaway from everybody. We could go down the line, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A.
I think to advance Canada's defense and security requirements, we need a national security culture that we don't have today, and we need increased accountability on behalf of the government, to be honest with the people, to describe what the threats are, and not play politics with our security.
I would say the men and women in the CAF today are the heirs of the force that took Vimy, that advanced further than anyone else on the Normandy landings. They are superb. I respect them. I admire them. Frankly, I love them. They deserve better leadership. They deserve a better electorate in a lot of ways. They are not the problem. So the good news is, if they were the problem, that would be hard to change. Better leadership, a more informed electorate that takes this more seriously, these are things that can change. And my hope in terms of the relationship with the U.S. is that the U.S. continues to view Canada as a trusted partner and friend, albeit one that needs to be told hard truths from time to time. I would suggest that the current administration is not saying anything new about Canadian underinvestment in defense. The content of the message has been the same since H.W. Bush. The tenor is particular to this particular president. That's a marked departure, but the actual substance has not changed. And so the onus is on us to listen.
I'd agree largely with that. I think kind of one point of departure would be that we're on the cusp of making the largest investment in our defense and security that we have in over 3/4 of a century. And despite the message being consistent about the need to do more, I think there's a lot of uncertainty from a Canadian perspective about where we would fit in a future American strategic vision, and figuring out how we collaborate moving forward, I think, is an open question that we want to get answered quickly.
I get the last word?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to bring up the term urgency. I think Canada needs to get a sense of urgency. When I left the military and went to law enforcement and government, that's the thing that was missing for me. I saw that a lot of things got delayed, things took a very long time to come into action, and here I am up here a decade later talking about something that I was mentioning a very, very long time ago. The China threat is real. We're in a hybrid war right now, and Canada needs to act. Canada needs to get together with the United States and start addressing the real threats at all the levels that we are experiencing them. 3,500 cyber attacks on government infrastructure within the province of British Columbia alone per minute. That statistic is from 2015. We have some very serious threats that we need to address. We've got the right people up here talking about how we need to move forward. The kinetic events are less likely. The hybrid war is here right now.
Thank you. On that very cheery note, yeah. We're going to open up with to audience Q&A, and I ask that you guys state your name and affiliation, please, before stating the question. Thank you.
Don't be afraid.
Dean Baxendale. My code name is The Publisher, and the publisher of The Mosaic Effect and a few other books on this particular subject. Great panel. Thank you for talking about the significant integration and our friendship and our partnership. What I want to get your perspective on is the investment in AI and that industrialization and how it will play a role for the military for Canada to step up its game. And also from a political perspective, I'm not sure, again, I think Mr. McGregor has made it quite clear that Canada really understands the existential threat that it is to itself and it is to sovereignty in the long run. But please, on the AI forum and how we can invest there to strengthen our military.
If somebody had asked me what's the number one capability that we're most deficient in the Canadian Armed Forces, I would have said information warfare. Scott did bring it up as an area, and so there's an element of that that connects to artificial intelligence and other I sorts of technologies. So I would say that your sense is correct. That's probably the area where fundamentally we have the greatest vulnerability right now.
I would never claim to be an expert on AI. I would say that in terms of our research in universities and industry, Canada is quite advanced in this domain in terms of how well it's been integrated with the military, specifically embryonic at best, security more broadly a bit better, but there's a lot of work to be done. To the question of whether Canada realizes how much it is an existential threat to itself, that is a very apt way of putting it. On the last panel, one of the panelists said that Canada is essentially very middle class. People worry about the standard of living, about how much their house is worth, about their retirement portfolio. On this level, Canadians don't appreciate enough how risky the current moment is. A tremendous amount of our economy depends on smooth, easy trade with the US. There is a point at which, if we don't take our own security seriously enough, the US will, in its own interests, harden the border. The numbers I cannot call to mind at the moment, but there's been research done showing that if every truck crossing the border is held for an additional 15 minutes, this adds a massive cost to the trade between Canada and the US. And this is perhaps, if I were worrying about the messaging, which is not generally what I work on, something I might use to get Canadians to pay more attention. Because talking about, the threat from PRC hybrid warfare, talking about Russia's ambitions in Europe, that seems very abstract. Talking about, have you thought about how much more your groceries will cost if the border is hardened? That's something that might gain more traction.
Just add kind of two bits. There's a concerted effort to try and incorporate more artificial intelligence and other advanced compute techniques. I think it's struggling for the same kind of attention and bandwidth dynamic I talked about in the past. We want to get more of that. We also just need the regular human intelligence in significantly increased quantities. So we're trying to get AI at the same time as trying to compete to increase by probably about a third the number of actual just troops in the ranks. More broadly, the government, part of it, has got a new industrial strategy. It's identified artificial intelligence with defense applications as one of the key areas it wants to focus in, drawing on some of the research strengths that Dr. Jensen talked about. So there's a big focus on that right now. I think it's just one of those things that it's really competing for attention as part of a really overheated change agenda.
As an operator, not a policymaker, the information warfare piece is very, very significant. And I mentioned it earlier about information sharing and the difficulties we have there between agencies, which is not necessarily something that I experienced as much while in the military, mainly because we didn't have that kind of interaction. There's really only one place in Canada where all that information moves between agencies above top secret. That's a problem. That issue needs to be addressed. And I believe that we've raised this enough that I'm sure that it's on the radar. AI, when you look at cyber or anything else like that, there's always a human factor. And the human factor is the key part. If you don't know what the threats are and you don't understand how they're being applied to you, it's very difficult. You can talk about a lot of things, but you don't necessarily get to act on those things. And that's kind of where I think the discussion needs to go next, is that we need to move away from just bringing in technology because it sounds like it's going to solve a problem. It's not going to solve a problem. It's not going to solve a problem until everyone gets together, discusses what those threats are and how to best address them. And it's not always done at the highest levels. A lot of times middle management are the ones that are experiencing these issues and the impediments to bringing that information forward so that we can act on those things. I hope that, coming to things like this, we can start to initiate those talks. The Americans have been doing this a long time. We tend to take a lot of what they do and apply it to our own military and other things. For instance, NATO standards is exactly how we train. That's how we've always trained, so we could be interoperable. Being interoperable doesn't mean you're leading. It means you're following And so when you create dissent within those arrangements, it's hard to move forward. So the first thing that needs to happen is we need to get together, start moving forward, getting back to basics, which is interacting and bringing, I would say, bringing more Canadians into the U.S. so they can start to understand better exactly how things get done. And this isn't just at a military level, this is at the law enforcement level, where we've worked extensively with U.S. agencies who have military collection assets so they can actually see a lot more than we can. When it comes to working with law enforcement in Canada, we rely on those how do I put it? We call it terror lines in the intelligence world, but where information is brought down from above top secret level to somewhere where it's actionable by people on the ground. That is something that needs to be addressed, and how we share that information, that's the technology piece. How do we get that? How do we keep operational security intact and then be able to address those threats?
Thanks. I'm Peter from MLI, one of Chris's colleagues. My question is about the structure and strategy of militaries. So I think there's my characterization, seems like Western democracies, as they can't afford the kind of losses that might come from kinetic on-the-ground warfare, have understandably invested more in the best technology and like air power, all these sorts of things. And other countries have invested more in, quantity over quality, for lack of a better word. So, high volume of tanks and equipment, but not always the best. And we're seeing in some recent conflicts, like in Ukraine and Iran, that, and in others, great success in like decapitation efforts that are high precision strikes and involve a lot of intelligence. That model seems to work really well there. But then in Ukraine and Iran, one interpretation might be, in fact, we run out of munitions pretty quickly, not willing to go in on the ground as much, and what does China and adversaries think of that? Is this kind of like a weakness, or am I mischaracterizing it? I'm just curious for your thoughts on that, and whether anything needs to change about military structure and strategy in light of that.
So we've largely bought into the various American offsets when it came to investing in quality of high technology in low density without a lot of scale. We did a small version of that basically across our armed forces. So that's left us, I think, with a similar dynamic to our American allies of we've got some exquisite capability, and hopefully we're going to make it a lot more exquisiter in the next 5 years as these investments roll forward. But we don't have a lot of anything. And I think more generally, having to figure out what a new balance is between really impressive technology, but also more quantity on the shelf and a production capacity collectively that can surge when needed. I think we've really seen the limitations of what we have comprehensively in the West in terms of production capacity. I think that's potentially a good opportunity, even just in CAN-US collaboration, to try and figure out like what are some of the most acute production limitations that we have right now, whether it's related to munitions, air missile defense capability systems, like what could we focus on doing in a coordinated fashion to overcome some of our inability to produce at scale, which I think we've seen manifest in a whole bunch of different ways, like you pointed out.
I was in Ukraine about 3 weeks ago and got to interact with some other officials who are dealing with challenges that you just described. Interestingly, I think as new technologies get introduced to militaries, they're additive. They're not replacement. And so, there's the age-old question of, do we ever need any more battleships, and when will the A-10 go away? That was a joke for anyone in the Air Force. But the notion that unmanned drones are going to replace some segment of military structure and capability, I think won't hold true. It will add. There'll be a continual, we now have to defend against and be able to operate in a battlefield where there's a greater variety of threats, not just you know, the UAVs are there, and we no longer have a role for tanks. The Ukrainians have found a way to employ tanks in that battlefield now to their advantage. So it's additive. We have a much more complex battlefield.
I agree with you. I think the drones are definitely a force multiplier. In terms of quality over quantity, just to give you an example, we don't have enough weapons to train with. When it comes to, say, the Carl Gustav, you know, an anti-tank weapon or something like that, we'll take 100 guys out and we'll have a demonstration, and then we'll select one of them to fire it. When our ships leave port and they're going to the Middle East, they stop in Hawaii to pick up missiles. They go to the Middle East, they come back, they drop the missiles off again. Canada has a procurement issue, and whether that's by design or not, it's difficult. It's difficult when you're the guys on the ground expecting to have the things you need. We have some of the best trained individuals in the world, bar none. That's why the Americans often come to us to command things, because then we have all the toys and tools to play with. These are the issues that we have. I would say, though, that in Ukraine, we're seeing what's being put against the Ukrainians. And where's that coming from? It's coming from Russia. And who's funding Russia? Well, that's China. We see Chinese weapons, we see Chinese money. And if you want to stop it, well, if you stop China, you're going to see a definite dent in the procurement of those weapons. So it all stems back to some of that corporate piece that I was speaking to. It's not as simple as let's get into a fight and see who's got the most guns or the best drones or the most drones. It's much larger than that. It's very complex. And you know, we're talking about it in simple terms up here. But to be honest, that's the focus that I think we need to look at, is engage with these corporations, and not just military procurement corporations, all of them. You just saw some of the things happening in the world. The United States imposed a $3.5 billion fine, the largest financial fine in history, against the Toronto Dominion Bank. That's very significant. How does that impact everything else? Well, funding that goes to China runs through the TD Bank. So when we start to hit those things, we can start to impact the adversaries that are starting these kinetic conflicts. So we just need to look at the root cause, and that's something I think needs further discussion. And I think the people in the room can bring that back to their organizations and further develop some of those thoughts.
I would say one of the transformations of the last few years is we've seen you don't need a navy to achieve denial. We saw this in the Black Sea with Ukraine. We saw it with the Houthis. We're seeing it right now in the Red Sea. Absolutely, this is additive. We should not divest high-end platforms in favor of smaller, attritable ones. Although I'd suggest the blend for each country is different, and this is where there's potentially a great opportunity for Canada. We are not going to build a fifth-gen fighter in Canada in the foreseeable future. We're not going to build our own version of Tomahawks. We can certainly build large volumes of attritable, uncrewed platforms. We can certainly build the kinds of weapons that Ukraine has used to achieve maritime denial in the Black Sea. If we do this well enough, and we should be able to because we have a very strong tech sector, we could build something that the rest of the world also wants to buy, which is not just good for our economy, but also would give us some leverage when we need to buy something that we cannot make ourselves. So yes, there's tremendous opportunity here for Canada.
And if I could just add on just one quick thing, and then we'll close off the session. I think something that people don't really consider is most Western militaries do not have a draft, and our adversaries view human life very differently than we do. So our force structure is made to accommodate human life. Theirs isn't. So I think that that's also like a big topic of conversation just across all Western Army structures, I think especially now. But yeah, I guess on that note, thank you everybody for joining us today. It was a really great session. So hope to see you around.
Thanks, Bella.